After setting up their first factory in Bengal at Hooghly in the year 1651, British East India Company spent the next century getting a foothold in Bengal. By the turn of the century, they found themselves in a military conflict with the Mughals, who at the time ruled Bengal. The result was Company's sound defeat, after which they decided that it would be unwise to take on the Mughals, and thus, they had to keep a low profile for a while. By the year 1707, taking advantage of the unrest in the Mughal Empire, the company got permission to fortify their garrison at Calcutta and subordinate factories at Kashim-Bazar, Dhaka and Balasore, thereby establishing Calcutta Presidency. Subsequently, new fortifications were put up and defenses further strengthened. By 1740s, the British were entertaining the idea of establishing an empire in India. According to them, they could easily conquer Bengal. But the East India Company was not yet in favor of this. Up until this point, while East India Company was establishing itself in Bengal, the Indian political scenario had undergone some major changes. Mughal Empire was on the verge of collapse after the expensive military campaigns of Aurangzeb in the south, his eventual death, and defeats against the strong Marathas. The ever-growing Maratha Empire, and Nadir Shah's invasion in 1737 dealt the final blow. Mughal power was severely impacted, and as a result they lost much of their territory to the Marathas, and several provinces controlled by Mughal governors broke away and stopped answering to them altogether. One such province was Bengal. Eventually Ali Vardi Khan, the ruler of Bengal at the time, realized that the English fortifications could become problematic. But before he could take any action, he died in 1756. He was succeeded by his maternal grandson, Mirza Muhammad, better known as Siraj-ud-Daulah, who had always expressed grave concern about the growing strength of the Europeans in Bengal to Ali Vardi Khan, objected to the abuse of the privilege of the custom-free trade by the English and had advocated a strong policy against them. As a consequence, the English developed an intense dislike for him. To make matters worse, they sheltered his enemies to the throne and continued with raising fortifications. On coming to the throne, Siraj-ud-Daulah asked both the English and the French to cease raising the fortifications, to which the French complied but the English didn't. Enraged, he attacked and captured Kashim-Bazar in June of the same year. He then marched to Calcutta and captured it as well after some initial resistance. After the fall of Fort Williams, Dhaka also surrendered. In these conflicts, the English strategy was defensive and they massively underestimated their opponents, whereas, the Nawab was fully aware of the European superiority in arms, ammunitions and navy. However, he imprudently allowed the English to stay on at Fulta, which would turn out to be a big mistake as it became a base for further English operations into Bengal. Humiliated, the English had kept a low profile at Fulta and started gathering intel on the Nawab in order to seduce his officers. Also, the Englishmen wanted to avenge the death of 123 English prisoners of war at Fort Williams, who were imprisoned overnight in cramped conditions and as a result had died from suffocation and heat exhaustion, in an incident which has now come to be known as the Black Hole Incident. A strong contingent consisting of 5 ships was sent to Fulta under the command of Robert Clive, the hero of the recently concluded Second Carnatic War. He sailed up the Hooghly River on the 29th of December 1756. First the fort at Baj Baj was captured after it was found to be deserted. Tana Fort was captured next after it was found to be similarly deserted. Forces of Nawab didn't provide much resistance at either Fort William at Calcutta or at Hooghly. The fort at Hooghly was blown up and the town itself was plundered, pillaged and burnt to ashes to send a message to the Nawab. The low resistance against the English is attributed to the disloyalty of the Nawab's officers who were probably in English pockets. In response, Siraj reached Calcutta in early February of 1757. Negotiations followed between the Nawab and the English. But it was a ruse, as Clive attacked and went straight for Siraj's position under the cover of fog. A fierce battle took place but the Englishmen were ultimately driven off. 57 Englishmen were killed and 125 were wounded, while the number of dead on the Nawab's side were tenfold. Although the number of casualties was much less on the English side, they had much fewer men to begin with and they could ill afford to lose even a single soldier. As a consequence, however, they lost the battle despite having the element of surprise. But as luck would have it, the Nawab was virtually forced by circumstances to sign the peace treaty on English terms, as the news that Ahmad Shah Abdali was advancing towards Bengal after his successful invasion of Delhi reached him. Further news came that the Nawab of Cuttack was planning an invasion in cahoots with the Marathas, which worsened his situation. Hence, on the 9th of February a treaty was concluded which restored all the property and revived all the privileges that the English previously owned and enjoyed. Having dealt with the Nawab for the time being, English attention shifted towards the French presence in Bengal. In March, Clive received a reinforcement increasing his force to about 2,600 men. The French at Chandernagor had only about 800 men. On the 13th of March, the English, ignoring the Nawab's orders to not attack the French, attacked Chandernagor, which surrendered on the 23rd after a stiff resistance. The English were able to defy the Nawab with impunity, who gave the impression that he was in fear of the English for some reason. Capture of Chandernagor gave the English total control over the river and brought safety to Calcutta. Next, Balasore was taken from the French without any fight. With this the French influence was ended in Bengal and the possibility of a Bengali-French alliance was thwarted. English were absolutely convinced that Siraj-ud-Daulah was a weak ruler and he could be easily replaced by a more favorable one. Thus started the English intrigues into his court and one such man who could replace the Nawab was found. He was Mir Jafar, the uncle of Siraj, who was already conspiring to overthrow Siraj when the British got wind of it and Clive was quick to secretly align with him. The aforementioned attack on the French had infuriated Siraj-ud-Daulah so much that he began making overtures of alliance with the French to expel the British out. Mir Jafar communicated this to the British who thought that there would not be a better opportunity to overthrow the Nawab of Bengal. Clive gathered a small army and moved up the river to take the Nawab head-on. Siraj had already moved his army to a village on the Hooghly River, known as Plassey. The English contingent led by Clive reached outside Plassey at 1 a.m. on the 23rd of June and it numbered around 3,000, consisting of 1,000 British redcoats and 2,000 Indian sepoys. They also had 8 6-pounder cannons and 2 howitzers. The Englishmen established their position in a grove of mangoes which extended from north to south for about half a mile. It was protected by a ditch and a mud wall, and was adjacent to an old hunting lodge. Meanwhile, the Nawab's forces were already encamped across the field, adjacent to the river Bhagirathi, behind earthen entrenchments. A hillock covered with trees stood outside the entrenchment. To the south of this hillock was a small water tank, and further south was a larger tank. Nawab's army was massive. It consisted of 35,000 infantry, 18,000 cavalry, about 50 24-pounder and 34-pounder cannons, with a reserve of 5,000 cavalry and 7,000 infantry under Siraj's most trusted general, Mir Mardan. In addition to these, a detachment of Frenchmen, consisting of 50 artillerymen and 6 field guns, had joined the Nawab's cause. However, despite the large numbers, almost 3/4 of the men were under the influence of Mir Jafar and his conspirators, Rai Durlab and Yar Lutuf Khan. So, the outcome of the battle depended largely upon whether or not Mir Jafar would actually betray Siraj. French posted 4 light field guns at the larger tank, which was the nearest to the grove, and 2 heavy guns were posted under a native officer in the right flank of the Nawab's army, which was positioned outside the entrenchment and was commanded by Mir Mardan and Mohan Lal. The rest of the Nawab's army extended itself in a vast curve. Thus, the British could not advance against the right flank of the Nawab's army without exposing their own right flank. All they could hope for was that Mir Jafar would be good to his word. Clive had positioned his troops just outside the grove, about 700 British redcoats in the middle, with 3 6-pounder guns on each side manned by additional 100 men. 1,000 Indian sepoys each were deployed on either side. He kept 2 field guns and 2 howitzers just ahead of the hunting house, under the shelter of 2 brick kilns. The action began at 8 a.m. when the French fired at the British position, and the entire right flank of the Nawab's army joined them by briskly firing their guns at the British. The British immediately returned fire but could not keep up, and after losing 30 men in the first half hour of the cannonade, they fell back into the grove. The English withdrawal to the grove encouraged the Nawab's army, and they continued the shelling with vigor. It, however, did little damage because the English soldiers had lied down behind the mud bank and also had made holes in it to fire through, which did some damage to the Nawab's army. The artillery duel continued till 11 a.m. and neither side gained any ground. Clive decided that it was futile to attack the Bengalis and that it would be best to remain in the grove till nightfall and attack the Nawab's camp at midnight. The English ceased the gunfire while the French and the Nawab's army continued. Soon, the battlefield was met with a heavy downpour of rain. While the British had covered their ammunition, Nawab's men had not. Their gunpowder became wet, thus rendering their guns useless for the time being. Thinking surely the British ammunition must be exhausted by now, Mir Mardon advanced towards the grove to drive them out. But an accidental shot mortally wounded him and his cavalry dispersed. Upon learning of this, the Nawab sent for Mir Jafar, who had not taken part in the battle at all. Siraj earnestly asked for help by throwing his turban at Mir Jafar's feet, who lied by swearing to render his utmost service. Meanwhile, another conspirator, Rai Durlab, advised Siraj to withdraw his men within the entrenchment and to return to the capital, leaving his generals to fight the English. Siraj did the same and returned to Murshidabad with 2,000 horsemen, after ordering his general Mohan Lal to withdraw his men behind the entrenchment. Unaware of all these developments but seeing the retreat of Nawab's right flank, Clive ordered his men to attack the enemy in 2 divisions, himself leading one. Meanwhile, Mir Jafar's army approached the grove in order to join them but was met with gunfire from the British, so he decided to be patient. The British forced the French behind the entrenchment and planted their artillery on the mound, which opened fire on the Nawab's army and the French behind their entrenchments. The Bengalis and the French fought fiercely for a while, but were routed and dispersed. By 5 p.m., the British were in possession of the Nawab's entrenchments and camp, and the battle was over. The British had emerged victorious at Plassey. Their losses amounted to 80 dead or wounded, while the Bengali side had about 500 casualties. Soon after the battle, Mir Jafar was declared as the new Nawab of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, and Siraj, who had fled, was captured and assassinated. On the 29th of June, Clive entered the city and formally installed Mir Jafar on the throne. A certain Warren Hastings, then 25 years of age, was selected to reside at the court as the company's representative. The new Nawab became a puppet in the hands of Clive, who was now the virtual ruler. Troubling times lay ahead for Mir Jafar.